Hi everybody, this is T. Falcon Napier. Welcome to our ChangeWorks System Coach Training Program. We're going to pick up where we left off today. Joining me as always is Dave Miller. Say hi, Dave.
Hello, everybody.
And today we're going to be talking about Lesson 5, Energies and Resonance. Now, as we work our way through this, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that you may have some familiarity with, but rather than applying your knowledge base in the way you have learned it up to now, I'm going to ask all of you to apply that knowledge base in a new and very specific sort of way. So hopefully that's very intriguing, but let's get into this. Now, to make it even more intriguing, I could have given this lesson a few other titles. I could have called it Comparative Human Typological Analysis. I could have called it The Merging of Brilliance. I could have called it Maps of Humanity. But we ended up with Energies and Resonance because this title speaks a little bit more to what it is that your clients are actually experiencing and what we are trying to help them connect with as we work with them with these principles of tension management as it applies to personal change. But let's talk a little bit about these other titles. So you see where it's all coming from. And I guess I'll start with The Merging of Brilliance. The Merging of Brilliance is an article that is up on the website. I'll give you a reference link to it in the resource center. It's also a short video that you might find interesting. Very often we're asked, where did this whole concept of tension management come from? And what are some of the historic and scientific foundations on which it's all based? And so we put together this article / video that gets into a little bit of the detail. I'm the kind of person who has always been fascinated by people who are fascinated by people. People themselves, I really don't find all that interesting, but people who are fascinated by people intrigue me. And the reason why they intrigue me is because they generally draw up what I refer to as maps of humanity. Maps of humanity are either very specific graphic and always conceptual models of how humans operate. And so basically people who create maps of humanity try to slice and dice the population into X number of groups. And then they try to describe each one of those groups sufficiently that they're distinguished from one another. Now, almost always maps of humanity have been deployed as personality tests or temperament assessments or some sort of other psychometric tool that is, again, designed to understand some specific aspect of how humans operate. And that's all fine, well and good. And I think that those of you who are already certified in different instruments may very well have learned one or more of these different maps of humanity. Now, the thing about these maps of humanity is that as much as these different researchers and authors and proponents would like to say theirs is the best or theirs is perfect for this application or that application, I don't find that whole debate and discussion all that valuable or interesting at all, because I see something else. I see that each of these different researchers and developers are looking at the way humans operate from a slightly different angle. One angle is no more valid or less valid than any other. I think they're all valid. I think they're all contributing some sort of additional understanding of how humans as a whole operate. And that's why I decided, rather than trying to pick one or whatever, I wanted to learn about all of them. And that's where we get into this concept of the merging of brilliance. So if I could take all these different human typological, analytical sorts of instruments, compare them, blend them together, merge them, the brilliance each one of them contains, I would end up with a true map of how humans actually operate. And so as we work our way through this little section today, I want you to kind of understand what was driving it. I wanted to find the truth, the single map that would describe humanity as completely as possible. What I learned by doing this, and up to this point in time, we've now merged together almost 400 different models of human behavior, is that they all overlap in a very grand way. So they reinforce one another, but they also each contribute something unique. Well, a lot of them contribute something unique. Most of them nowadays are just kind of repackaging what's already been discovered. Nevertheless, they kind of benefit from one another by revealing blind spots and filling that blind spot with insights and understanding that helps to make the map more complete, more robust. So as we look at the change grid, what I hope you can embrace is that the change grid is actually the result of combining all of these different maps of humanity into a single map. Now, while that's a really wonderful thing to kind of appreciate and understand, what also ends up happening is that we can no longer use the result to say this is a test that determines someone's personality or whatever. The reason for that is because the change grid is not about the person. The change grid is about how this person happens to be responding to a specific activity at a very specific moment in time. So rather than being a static instrument, that psychometric tool is trying to say you are a whatever, the change grid allows you to look at the activities rather than the person, so you can say, well, you may or may not be a whatever. That's for other tests to help you explore and understand. But what we do know is that based on how you are responding to this particular activity at this particular moment in time, we can say you are now exhibiting a certain energy around that particular activity. If we looked at a different activity, you could be displaying a very different sort of energy. And so, as we work our way through this, you may be hearing references to certain types that these other models and tools and maps have come to label, but we are not labeling the person. We are not trying to put the person into some sort of box. We are instead saying that as far as a given activity is concerned, you are displaying, feeling the energy that others may use to describe a personality. You're just experiencing it about this particular activity. That'll make great sense as we work our way through that. I just wanted to make sure I'm very clear from the beginning that this is not a personality test. The change grid is not a traditional psychometric tool. The change grid is not intended to put someone in some sort of labeled box to make us compartmentalize who they are and the range of capable responses and expressions they're capable of having. We say, nope, every human being has a full change grid available to them. Every single possible attitude, belief, behavior that is possible for a human to experience or display is available to every one of us given a certain set of circumstances. So the change grid is about exploring those circumstances so that we can better understand and help our clients to understand how they're responding at a given particular time to a specific activity again, and why that might be happening. From that point of understanding, we can then help them to make some decisions. Are they okay with where they are? Does this feel right to them? Do they resonate with that? And would they like to remain there? Or is there a different energy that may support them more effectively in making whatever change it is that they are exploring with us or trying to make? So hopefully you guys can all embrace that distinction, because that distinction is vitally important as you go about becoming a ChangeWorks system coach. Anyone have any questions, comments about this at this point?
No, we're good.
Okay, all right, great. So with that, Let's start taking a look a little bit about the change grid. Now, again, the change grid exists as an online instrument or as a paper and pencil kind of interactive tool. But the most important thing that we want you to take from your training here is that everything that we are doing, everything that we're saying, can actually be used with great effect purely conversationally. And so we really don't want you as coaches to even consider setting aside everything that you've learned and everything that you've been doing up to now, everything that you have come to embrace and believe in its effectiveness. No, we want you to simply overlay these principles of tension management onto the work that you're already doing, and then let a natural evolutionary process sort of occur. You will integrate a great deal of these concepts into the work you're naturally doing, and perhaps you will use some of these tools and techniques and insights and understanding from your training and tension management to add something unique and distinctive to the work you're doing and how you happen to be deploying it. All that said, I do need to show you a few diagrams so that conceptually you can understand where things fit. And as we learn where these things fit, we can also talk about how where that is revealed conversationally. So with that, the diagram you're looking at on the screen right now is the change grid composite diagram. If you are using the online system, this is one of the background images you can choose to display anytime you want behind whatever the activities are that you're exploring with your client. If you have not already done so, we would encourage you to watch the video that explains how to use the online system, and certainly that this will all make far more sense when you understand how that operates. Now, the diagram here is the composite, and yes, we have heard all kinds of wisecracks made over all these years about that it looks like a test pattern for a color TV set. Now, anyone who says that is greatly dating themselves because today media is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But there was a period of time for our younger students that television actually went off for the night. And when television went off for the night, it would show you this little pattern and play this tone that was very irritating at best. It was just the way they signed off. And yeah, we get it. It does look a lot like that little test pattern that we saw when TV signed off. And I get it. I get the message behind it. Visually, you're looking at something that at first glance seems very complex, and some would label it as confusing, but it's just unfamiliar. I promise you that as you work your way through this training, that will become abundantly clear to you. What you're looking at are all the different layers of the change grid simultaneously, or to put it into terms that match what we started talking about a few moments ago, you are looking at all of those maps of humanity, literally hundreds of maps of humanity superimposed upon one another, revealing a single diagram that allows you to understand where everything fits, how it all works together, and what's really going on with this thing called human. Okay, so, but you don't learn it as a composite diagram, you learn it layer by layer. In fact, there's an enrichment webinar series we'll point you all to called the Change Grid Layer by Layer, and it spends a good deal of time doing exactly what the name implies, going into the change grid layer by layer and explaining a great deal about what's happening at that layer and how the models that you may have learned that fit on that layer are actually even more useful to you than you imagined when you went through that particular training. So, so far you have learned about one of the layers of the change grid, and that's the layer that divides it into the 5 response states. And so those response states again, up at the top were stress, power, power apathy, and apathy. So we won't be going into that in any great detail as a refresher today, but you guys all know you can go back to any lesson we've already completed if you want to review what that particular layer is all about. So these are, again, the 5 response states, the 5 different levels of tension that a person can be experiencing. Now, the reason why it's important to look at other layers is because having 5 wedges as useful and interesting as that may be, doesn't begin to tell the whole story. So for example, if we look in power right in the middle of the change grid, are we suggesting that your experience of being in power is identical if you're way over here to the left where things are getting very kind of tight in that little diagram versus way out here to the right? Are we suggesting that if I'm in the upper part of this power sort of wedge, that that's identical to being in the lower part or over somewhere in the middle? No, each one of these spots of the change grid can be addressed individually. And each one of these individual intersections on this grid you're looking at is slightly different than any of its neighbors. But even though the differences may be slight, the impact can be quite profound in the way the person is thinking about what's going on, is taking action or considering taking action. And so we needed more detail. We need to be a little bit more granular, more specific. And that's what these other layers allow us to do. Well, let's take a look at a layer of the change grid that divides it into 4 quadrants. Now, many, if not all of you, are fluent, perhaps even licensed, in one or more quadrant-based typing systems. And there are a great many out there. In fact, of the 400 models we've looked at, probably 320 or more, yeah, around there, 320 of them only look at 4 types. And they all have different language they use. We'll explore that in just a second. But a great majority of the maps of humanity that have been created, and by the way, this whole merging of brilliance process, this whole exploration for these maps of humanity actually goes back thousands of years. But the majority of these different maps divide humanity into 4 convenient groups. And so let's take a little bit of a deeper look at what's going on with these 4 quadrants. First of all, let's give them names that we can use conversationally. The 4 names we're going to give them are upgrid, and upgrid is the quadrant that is up at the top of the grid, so how confusing, upgrid. And then downgrid is the one that's at the bottom. Outgrid is over to the right, and ingrid is towards the left. As you start to become more fluent in your use of these tension management principles and the language that goes along with it, you will often find yourself saying things like, feeling upgrid about something, or acting very outgrid, or having a downgrid moment, or needing to move ingrid. So when you hear us using those terms, that's what we're talking about, moving in the direction of one of these 4 quadrants. Now, we could say that someone is upgrid, is outgrid, downgrid, or ingrid, but we will never say the person is an outgrid person. This is not about labeling the person. We would say, however, that as far as this particular activity is concerned, the person has a lot of outgrid energy. They're very outgrid about whatever that activity happens to be, or upgrid, downgrid, ingrid. Again, we are using these words to indicate an energy, and that energy, it's just a little word that contains the amount of tension they have, the amount of drive they have, the amount of tension that they happen to be experiencing around it. It's more about what's going on with their attitudes, their beliefs, their behaviors. That's what the word outgrid, upgrade, ingrid, downgrade attempts to encapsulate. So with that, let's take a bit of a deeper dive into these 4 different quadrants and see what patterns there may be that'll be useful in helping a client to understand how they happen to be thinking about a particular activity and responding at this point in time. So let's begin with this. 2 of these types, oh, even listen to what I just said, and I do say that, but I even have to correct myself. That's how common this all has been. We are talking about energies, not types. So, but allow me to use that word just to make conversation a little more fluid. So, two of these quadrants, two of these energies, two of these types are very fast to take action, and two are really quite slow. Now, one of the ways that you can go about figuring out which ones are which is to look at the levels of tension that the quadrant is all about. So if you're upgrid, you've got a big chunk of stress. If you see this wedge here, again, that's stress. There's a big chunk of stress. There's quite a bit of power stress, and there's this little bit of power in that wedge. So you guys can see three levels of tension, the three more upgrid tensions, higher levels of tension that are in there. So would you predict that the upgrid area of the change grid is where actions are taken quickly or slowly? What would you think there? And again, you guys can interact with the question panel. I'm just going to give you a little second to think about it, and then we'll reveal the answers. Now, similarly, the outgrid energy also has a little bit of power stress, quite a bit of power, and a little bit of power apathy. So again, relatively speaking, would we think that someone who is in the outgrid quadrant is more about doing something quickly or slowly? If we look at the downgrade energy is made up of a big chunk of apathy, a nice part of power apathy, and a little bit of power. But interestingly enough, if you look at in-grid, the in-grid quadrant contains all five levels of tension in perfect proportion, but in a shrunken sort of world. So do you think that would be more of a fast or a slow energy for action being taken? So Dave, what kind of insights are people sharing, or thoughts are they sharing? What do they think goes where?
Well, we're seeing the two fast ones as upgrid and outgrid.
And so let's take a look at that. Then, though that is in fact yay, good for all of you. Upgrid tends to be fast. Fast, by the way, because the tension is driving it. So think about that. When we talk about tension, you'll learn this in great detail as time goes on. But definitive change only occurs two places on the change grid. Upgrid changes are driven by external factors. So something that's going on in the person's environment, in their situation, is pushing them to do something. And think about that. To be up in stress, you have to believe that your level of ability is quite low and the challenge is very high. So this challenge is pushing you beyond what you think you're capable of doing. And so what ends up kicking in is a lot of instinct, a lot of reactive decision making, reactive action taking as well. And again, you guys can go back to your reference guide on the 5 levels of tension to find a lot of detail to support this. Thoughts,
One
Dave?
question, one question on that was, well, what about if someone gets paralyzed up in stress?
Now, when we start talking about those sorts of behaviors, and they actually occur in all 4 quadrants, we're going to be looking at the dark side of the change grid. Will be by the end of this little lesson, we're going to be learning about danger zones and powerless points. So yes, it's very true that someone who's up in stress can be so far up in stress that their primal instincts get kicked in about what to do when they are truly in a life-threatening situation.
Mm-hmm.
Usually we talk about the fight or flight response, but as you explore maps of humanity, you find out that someone said, no, 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 no. There are 4 different ways that people respond to a life and death situation. Fight and flight, we've already talked about. There's also freeze and fade. And so freezing is you becoming immobile, become motionless. And fade is you do your very best to disappear into the background. So you're not running, that draws attention to you. You're not fighting, that obviously puts your jeopardy into an even greater level. These are more about avoidance behaviors. Can I simply freeze so no one notices me, I'm not there at all, so, or do I just try to blend into the background? So those are the 4
Yeah, and
different
you can
ways. Yeah.
kind of see like which quadrant they might go into,
Well,
right?
exactly. And now, as we start talking about the dark side of the change grid, we start talking about the the danger zones and the powerless point, we are starting to talk about a more advanced concept in it. And certainly at a certain point in your training and your follow-up ongoing professional education that all of you are encouraged to participate in, you'll learn a great deal about the dark side of the change grid, where all of these problematic areas come together, and we'll be starting to tip our toe into all that as we work our way through today's lesson. But you're absolutely right. Upgrid is definitely fast to make decisions. Again, people who are upgrid tend to make changes driven by external factors. The outgrid quadrant is also characterized by fast action, but instead of the fast action being dictated by external factors, this fast action is being dictated by internal factors. So again, remember that outgrid is a very large chunk of power with a little bit of power stress and a little bit of power apathy at the respective top and bottom corners of the quadrant. And so all the things that you know about power are holding true on steroids. So we know that people that are in power are very logically ruled. They're feeling very confident about their situation. A great deal of pride is pushing them forward. They view their ability as being quite high and the challenges being equally high. So they feel like they're in a bit of a test situation where they have to show up, do it, and prove themselves. And so a great deal of the results that come out of power were self-directed choices, intentional, deliberate actions that the person is taking. So anytime you are taking the bull by the horns and doing it, not driven by stress again, not because of fear and anger and grief and shame and all that stuff that happens upgrade, but instead coming from that conscious, deliberate intentionality, those changes are taking place outgrid, but they're being driven by internal factors as opposed to external factors. Very often in our work as coaches and human development professionals, we work with people who tend to be very reactive. Their changes seem to be ruled by things that are happening outside of them, and we work with them to become people of more deliberate, conscientious intentionality. And we just ask them basic questions to get the ball rolling. What do you want? Why, what is it you're trying to accomplish? In some ways, what we are trying to do is exercise that individual's ability to make outgrid changes instead of wait for external variables to impose themselves and drive the change happening in a more upgrid sort of a state. So hopefully you guys can connect with that. In fact, I'll bet you've had your fair share of clients who tend to operate in the upgrid quadrant. And hopefully you're working with people who are in the outgrid quadrant that are just trying to move to the next level, trying to advance themselves in a very, again, conscientious, deliberate, thoughtful, intentional sort of way. Thoughts about upgrid being quick or outgrid being quick?
No, everyone's
Okay.
following.
Now that leaves downgrid and ingrid. Downgrid is slow because just look at the levels of tension that are associated with being downgrid. A great deal of it is apathy. Again, apathy doesn't mean apathetic. Apathy just means that you don't have a lot of feeling around it one way or another that's compelling you to do much of anything. And you're in a situation where you view your abilities very high, the challenge is very low, and so what's the hurry? What needs to be done anyway? And so it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that actions that are taken, or the energy of downgrid tends to be slow to take action. And the person who's in grid tends to be slow to take action because they tend to be more conservative. Reluctant might not be fair to say, because at all times they aren't reluctant. They're just saying, no, I really do want to be very thoughtful and very prudent and very careful and all that. So the reluctance isn't coming from a personality trait necessarily, as much as they're saying, like, look, I'm in a situation where my ability is not all that great, but the challenge is also not all that great. And so rather than throw myself into an unknown situation on a task that isn't demanding my attention right now, why don't I just be very conservative around this? So let me look at it a little bit more, see if it needs to be done. So there's this slow result in the on the action side of things. So this is how fast and slow action taking overlays or resonates on the change grid. Thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I almost think of someone like on vacation playing a game or doing a puzzle that they haven't done before,
Yeah,
something like that. It's like it's not that hard, but they don't have a lot of ability because they've never done it before,
right,
but
exactly.
they're just taking their time and relaxed about it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a mellowness that's going on. They're not bored by it. They are engaged
Hmm.
enough to actually be playing. But you're absolutely right. Let's look at another set of attributes. So some of those maps of humanity would say that two of their types are very people oriented, and two of the types are very task oriented. So two a little bit more concerned about people and how people are involved, and two more concerned about task or how the work itself is being focused upon. So again, they're talking about types, we're talking about energies. So two of these energies are more people oriented and two seem to be more task oriented. It tends to be easier to identify where the task ones fall as you think about this. So let's think about that. Who's more task oriented? Is the outgrid, upgrid, downgrid, ingrid? Who are the task masters?
Oh, Alcred definitely,
Yeah,
I
because
think,
look about it. Yeah,
resonates, right?
yeah, because outgrid is saying, look, my ability is very great and the challenge is very great. Let's get this done. So they tend to be very task oriented at the extreme, often at the expense of the people side of things. So people that are very driven to accomplish tasks often have to be reminded that people are involved. So who else is task oriented?
I'm going to say downgrid.
Yeah, now think about the downgrid person has mastered the activity. They're saying their ability is very high, the challenge is very low. They tend to be very task oriented, but the tasks are not anything that is uh, pushing them to do something right away. So this is more where tasks fall into habits and routines, kind of a predictable sort of way of doing things. And again, as we said when we talked about the levels of productive tension, when you first learned to drive a vehicle, you were probably very far up in stress because your ability was low, the challenge was high, it had buttons and knobs and pedals, it moved. But this was a very upgrade experience for you. But as you did it more and more and more, as your competency increased, you moved further and further down grid. And so now you can certainly still perform the task, but the task is, almost autopilot. So, and that leaves the other two as people oriented. We'll talk a little bit more about how they express their people orientation a bit more, a bit differently from one another. But the upgrid and the in grid quadrants also tend to be more people oriented in their energy. Let's look at another aspect of it. Two of these types, and I did that in air quotes for those of you who can't see through the internet, two of these types are very global in their outlook and approach. They like the big picture. And two tend to be very detailed in their outlook and approach. So which two tend to be more detail oriented and which two tend to be more globally oriented? And again, we're looking at energies, not personalities.
Well, detailed, certainly I'm drawn to the downgrid
Yep.
for that.
Yep. And so, and when we think about outgrid, like for a second, let's say there are outgrid people out there. We'll just say for a moment that these maps of humanity that are talking about personality type are right. There are people that live outgrid, and I don't argue that point. They certainly are people that are like that. People that are very outgrid, that are very task oriented, that are very fast to make sorts of take actions, etc. Do those types of people have a tendency to be more big picture focused or more detail focused?
I would say more big picture focused.
More big picture focused. In fact, very often that personality type tends to be associated with organizational leaders and entrepreneurs. And
Mhm.
one thing that we will rarely accuse an entrepreneur of being is detail focused. Usually, what helps the entrepreneur become successful is they align themselves with some real detail oriented people to take care of the specifics. And their mind is more about the big picture. They know where they're trying to go. That's a thing of great beauty. But the minutia of how to get there, nah, that tends to weigh them down. And again, now we're talking about personality types, but we're saying no. There's this energy of being outgrid, and this will hold true. All
Hey
right, let's.
T,
Yeah,
John has a question going back to the people and task oriented.
yeah.
In fact, I'll just unmute him so he can ask it.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
So I find a lot of times that, dealing with people in job search, that, one of the core problems is people who are very introverted. And very often what I see is they're very in-grid or up-grid about the people tasks. So how does that jive with the idea that in-grid and up-grid are the people orientation?
Well, they are people oriented, but a people orientation does not necessarily mean a positive people orientation. There could also be a negative people orientation to it as well. So, for example, people that are upgrid, now we're talking about the personality type for someone who is upgrid, can be very excited and enthusiastic and love being around people, but at the same time have a very long list of enemies and people that annoy them and on and on. And so that energy is still people oriented, but not necessarily positively or negatively oriented. The people orientation we find on the in-grid side of things could either be a person who is very caring about others, but could also be someone who feels very submissive to others. And so they're still people oriented, but it's not necessarily a positive way of framing around it. Does that help?
I guess. I mean, I still struggle with it because, you know, a lot of times those who they're very, very uncomfortable with any of the people-oriented tasks,
Yeah, they're
networking,
withdrawn.
interviews. That's their weak spot. That they hate doing it,
Yep, yep, yep,
and they
yep.
rate themselves very in grid or very much in stress around any task associated with that.
Yeah, you're
So I
exactly
wouldn't
right. Yeah.
so I wouldn't have
Well,
called them people.
no, they're not positive people. They are people who are looking at others and how others intimidate them, how others make them feel uncomfortable, how others make them feel intimidated, how others that feeling of intimidation almost requires that the belief another person exists is there. And that this person is their bully or this person is their limiting factor. And as long as they continue to believe that they are subservient to other people or inferior to other people, getting them to move more out grid, where they do become a little bit more self-directed, more intentional, more deliberate, more forceful, is the real struggle. And so, even though they may not be positively people-oriented in a caring and supportive, nurturing sort of way, they are still more concerned about the people that are involved and how those people are impacting them, perhaps more so than how they could be impacting other people. What you're actually describing, though, is the in-grid danger zone. The in-grid danger zone is when all of the worst possible aspects of this in-grid energy begin to display themselves. And inside of about a dozen or so slides, I'm going to show you a whole set of adjectives that describe exactly what's going on in the in-grid danger zone. And similarly, we'll see the up-grid danger zone and see that all of the negative people aspects of being up-grid will all be contained there too. So I think you're absolutely right. And this, I think, is also showing us why it's very important that we look at energies more so than personalities if we are trying to help an individual to make whatever changes it is that they're really trying to make.
T, a slightly different angle on this, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, is when I think of outgrid, I think, of the extremes, that energy. It's like I'm going to get something done and no one's going to get in my way. So I'm very focused on the task. If I'm downgrid, I'm saying I'm so good at this, I don't need anybody else to get it done. Whereas, like you're saying, if you're upgrid, you're paying a lot of attention to people and maybe how they're affecting you and how they could be getting in the way, and there could be fear, there could be other things. And again, I'm going to the extremes.
Absolutely.
And the in-grid, it could be about, that nurturing piece of
right. Well, absolutely.
Like that. So,
well, and even think about this. Maybe the reason why the person, going to John's example, who's on a job search, is hesitant to do the task, get the job, take the job, is because they feel negatively judged by other people, or they're afraid of exposing themselves to other people. So even though a task is involved, what is more powerfully influencing their movement is the way they're looking at the people side of things more so than the task side of things. And I think as we allow all this to come together, and again, this is why I started creating this whole merging of brilliance thing, because I said something's got to explain that better. So, because I can't just say that everybody's everything that's on the in-grid side of things. There are subtleties, there are nuances. And those of us that are working as coaches and other forms of human development professionals, we need to understand these nuances, these subtleties, these gentle stopping points that happen throughout all that, because there is no such thing as a person who is confined to one quadrant. But assume for a moment there was such a thing as being confined to one quadrant. That person is still not experiencing everything that is true about that quadrant simultaneously. So certain aspects of what happens in that quadrant or in that type display themselves given a certain set of circumstances. So there's even subtleties and nuances inside of each one of these personality types, which is again why understanding the full change grid ends up being a very empowering tool. Okay, so let's take a look at another little layer. We did global, we did detail oriented. Oh, did I? Yeah, global and detail. And then open and closed, willing to share one's own truth or hold it all back. So which two types tend to be more open with other people, and which two tend to be more closed with other people? Who's holding back? Who's openly sharing?
Well, again, I'll start with the easy one. Outgrid, I would think, is fairly open.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, usually the types say close because the outgrid person likes to be very calculated in what parts of their truth they reveal. They're always playing a game of poker. If you look at the models that describe this as being a particular type. So that outgrid energy that's very forceful, dominant is one of the descriptors of using it. They are open to the degree that they believe serves them well, and then they'll hold other information back. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and think about this, how anyone who's out there, a risk taker, a big risk taker, does a big risk taker reveal everything openly, or do they think before they speak? And when they say something, was it calculated and deliberate, or was it something that was spontaneous and they didn't even give a thought to it? So generally speaking, the person who's outgrid tends to be closed, but perhaps calculated is a more accurate term for it. The downgrid person is closed, not because they're calculating or deliberate about it, but because they just don't care to participate. They don't have enough energy to really want to share openly. Where people that are more on the in-grid side of things and up-grid side of things are having an energy that supports more about that openness. And in part, it's because both upgrid and ingrid contain a large slice of stress. Stress is very talkative. Um, and even power stress. Power stress has a lot of urgency around it. And so both of those would more stimulate someone being more open, talkative, responsive, perhaps reactive to what's going on. Now, again, this is all just for fun to give you a glimpse. Two of these types tend to be more direct in their communication, and two are more indirect. So two of them are going to give you the what, for, and no uncertain terms, and the others are going to be more guarded, diplomatic, um, well, indirect is the word I'm using for indirect. So who's going to be very direct?
Yeah, maybe this is where my head was going before.
Yeah.
Because again, an outgrid person, I think, would be more direct because they're on a mission.
Yeah, direct, interesting. Direct but closed. So
Yes.
what they choose to share, they choose to share in no uncertain terms.
Right.
But is it the whole story? Where again,
Right.
loose
Right.
lips sink ships. The person who is very far upgrid is both
Mm-hmm.
open and direct. So they just keep talking and talking and talking.
Sinking the whole armada.
Right, there you go. And so where the person who, again, in grid tends to be indirect because, again, they are being more conservative, calculated, and at the worst case scenario, they are very subservient. And so they tend to be very indirect if they say anything at all, because
Mm-hmm.
again, they tend to be open but indirect. So they share, but they share very cautiously about what's going on, and they don't want to share anything that's too direct.
Mm-hmm.
Those of you who really want to understand tension management, we could also overlay on the change grid different stereotypical cultural patterns. So certain cultures tend to overlay in very specific places on the change grid. So for example, we've done a tremendous amount of work in the Netherlands. If you ask the average Dutch person to characterize the average American, and we know how valid those kinds of generalizations happen, but nevertheless they happen all the time, they would characterize Americans as being two things. Number one, very forceful, very driven to do something, and number two, very direct. So we're characterized as being loud and boisterous. Um, Meanwhile, the Dutch also tend to be very much on top of things, very sure of themselves, very confident, but they prefer to be a little bit less, um, direct about that. So it's an interesting little phenomenon if you want to start overlaying cultures onto it. So yeah. Now, this one I think is the most fun. Of the four types, upgrade, outgrid, downgrade, ingrid, which one is likely to arrive early for a meeting? Which one is likely to arrive exactly on time? Which one believes that the meeting begins when they get there? And which one is likely to arrive later? Say, meeting? Was there a meeting?
Mm-hmm.
So, where do these four fit? So, I think the easiest one is which one believes the meeting begins when they get there? Or which one says meeting? Was there a meeting?
Someone said outgrid for that first one.
Yeah, the outgrid energy very much believes that the meeting starts when they arrive, because again, the outgrid energy is going to resonate very much with people who are in charge. Again, they rate their ability as being very high. They rate the challenge as being high, very task-oriented, very direct. And so whether they're late or early, when they get there, time to get going, time to get going. The person who's upgrid is the one who tends to be late or go, meeting, was there a meeting?
Right.
Downgrade person tends to be a bit more precise. On time, and the person who is very far in grid or the in-grid energy tends to arrive early in the most positive light, because they want to make sure that everything's ready so everyone else is comfortable when they get there. So
Yeah, that just reminds me of when John and I co-hosted a webinar one time. We had some weather issues that caused us to start a minute or two late. And after the webinar, I got an angry email from someone saying, I didn't stay on your webinar because you started late and you reflected, that you didn't care about my time. Even though I explained there was a weather problem, he says, well, according to my atomic clock, started like a minute late. So that person was probably down grid.
Yeah, well, these are, and that's all fine. But yeah, there isn't it interesting? It's just so interesting. People operate
Yes.
this way. I find people
Atomic clock. Okay.
intriguing to me. So if we put it all together, if you have a client who has an activity that is plotting out grid, or forget the grid itself, they're just having conversation around a particular activity, a goal, whatever, and they're coming across as being fast to take action, task-oriented, big picture, closed, direct, believe it, that's what that outgrid energy feels like. The upgrade energy, very fast, people-oriented, big picture, open, direct, but tends to be a little bit late. Punctuality goes. That's the upgrade energy. You can see the other four combinations that are there. Well, interestingly enough, this came to give rise to a lot of different personality typing systems. And so perhaps the most prevalent out there today is the DISC profile. So outgrid is that D type, and upgrid is I, ingrid S, downgrid C. So dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. If we go back to the social styles model, driver, expressive, amiable, and analytical were those four quadrants. Or another one, social styles, I think it was director, socializer, relator, and thinker. That might not be right as far as the name of the model. The four Ps, powerful, popular, peaceful, and perfect. You go way, way back in time. And you'll find that people said you're a choleric, a sanguine, a phlegmatic, or a melancholic. Some do it with the four seasons of the year: summer, spring, autumn, and winter. And some do it with the four key elements of nature: fire, air, water, and earth. So it's interesting that so many of these maps of humanity, and obviously here I'm showing you 8 of them. There are hundreds of them that have done this. In fact, there's one that's all about the 4 houses in Harry Potter, and each one overlays in one of these quadrants. They're all simply different descriptors or labels for a set of characteristics that they associate with each one of these 4 quadrants. And so the last thing I'll do before we end today's call is I want to show you what happens when you look at all those models and blend them together. Every one of those models attempts to describe each of their 4 types using a specific set of adjectives. And they will give for each one of the types a set of positive adjectives and a set of negative adjectives. And in doing so, they're trying to help you understand what that type is all about, and hopefully differentiate that type from the other type so that it can stand on its own and be something you can resonate with. So and, oh, by the way, there's lots of other models here like fiery red, competitive, demanding. So they come up with adjectives. Well, what we did was we looked at all these different models of human behavior. We looked at all their types. We extracted all the adjectives that they used and compiled those adjectives to see which ones occurred consistently. And so for the outgrid quadrant, we had a whole bunch of relatively positive sort of characteristics, and you see a whole list here: accomplished, adventurous, ambitious, authoritative, determined, disciplined, impressive, pioneering, rational, visionary. There's a lot of positive, relatively speaking, sorts of words they use to describe adjectives they've used. But they would also describe the outgrid person as being abrupt and arrogant and cocky and impatient, manipulative, relentless, stubborn, unsympathetic, violent, wicked, and warmongering. So it's really interesting. And again, we just took the adjectives that these people who developed these models decided to share in their descriptions for each of these types. If you were upgrid, you were animated and enthusiastic and emotional and expressive and extroverted, motivating, optimistic, promoting, sociable, spontaneous, thrilled. And then they would also say, but you could also be alarming and attacking, dramatic, impulsive, inconsistent, loquacious, opportunistic, overactive, reactive, undisciplined, unfocused, unpredictable, unreliable, unrealistic, and wasteful. So the upgrade characteristics are there. And by the way, again, as you start to use the change grid, you're going to find that these adjectives do in fact occur inside of that quadrant, but they do not all happen simultaneously. So under a certain set of circumstances, even this upgrid person will sometimes be gregarious and happy, and other times they'll be insecure and intimidating. So we have to move these adjectives around because there's overlaps. And as we start to understand how the different energies change as we move from one section of the change grid to the other, we start to find the particular home. Ultimately, we'll be giving all of you a reference tool that you can use called the Comprehensive Adjective Map. The Comprehensive Adjective Map shows over 1,000 adjectives scattered all over the change grid in precise locations where that adjective would hold true, and obviously all the other locations it would hold less true, if not untrue altogether. So you'll see how this all kind of sorts together. In grid, the person would be accommodating, cool, cooperative. And they even said there that they could be cautious, efficient, inoffensive, optimistic, polite, quiet, undemanding, warm, but they could also be described as being abused, afraid, aloof, simple, sluggish. These are actual words that people use. Can you imagine a personality type and you get your results and it describes you as being simple?
And spineless.
And spineless. It's kind of like, I'm not going to pay you money to be insulted. So nevertheless, these are the words. Parasitical, there's one you want.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
yeah, and then finally, downgrade characteristics: accurate, analytical, calculating, deliberate, perfectionist, strict, systematic, but they could also be described as being apathetic, gluttonous, oblivious, opinionated, pessimistic, stingy, unhappy, stuffy. I mean, there's all these that you do. So again, I'm showing you all these just to say that countless models have attempted to describe humanity in these 4 different ways, and these are the adjectives that they have actually used. Now, as we start to move these adjectives around on the change grid, something very interesting happens, and that is the danger zones. What we've learned by performing these integrations is that the adjectives do start to shift, and ultimately all of the negative adjectives associated with each of those 4 types move into a danger zone. So if you are in the upgrade danger zone, this is where you become dramatic and egotistical and manipulative and all these other relatively negative sorts of adjectives. The positive ones would have been elsewhere in that quadrant, but the negative ones tend to be defined or tend to be confined to the danger zone. Similarly, if you're outgrid in the outgrid danger zone, this is where you become very impatient and insensitive and spoiled and all those sorts of things that we're looking at here. Brutal, cocky, all that sort of thing. Bullying behaviors. Downgrid, this is where you become very negative, irritable, pessimistic, etc. And in grid, this is where you become very sluggish, spineless, stubborn, timid, trapped, unassertive, etc. Now, if you looked at the adjectives, you'll also find that some of the adjectives are repeated in multiple blocks. So some of these negative adjectives appear in more than one danger zone, and even some of the positive attributes appear in more than one of those quadrants. So how is that possible? Well, as we start to explore the adjective map in more detail, and we start to look at these other layers of the change grid, you will see how things begin to shift. So my final note for today is that I just want to say to all of you that a wonderful contribution has been made to the work that we all do today by all of these researchers and developments from years gone by who have thought about and formalized and created maps of humanity to help us better understand how this thing called the human truly operates. But what we do and what we focus entirely on is not who the person is, but instead how the person happens to be responding to a particular activity at a specific moment in time. So just because someone may be in one of these danger zones about a particular activity right now does not mean that that describes the person at their essence or in their totality. Similarly, if we went back to the positive characteristics, we could certainly say with great confidence that the energy that they're describing right now or experiencing right now tends to be a downgrade energy around this particular activity. So right now their energy is one that's stimulating them to be very methodical and diplomatic and all those words, or maybe it's more of the outgrid sorts of qualities, and we're saying right now, as far as that activity is concerned, you're feeling very confident, courageous, determined, enterprising, independent. All that could very much hold very true and be a very powerful, supportive insight to share with your client or have your client even better realize for themselves. But we are never, and I mean never in all capital letters, triple underlined, using the change grid as a personality test or as anything like that. We're just saying, you know, there's this full range of ways that people can be responding to a particular activity. And right now, it sounds like the way you're responding is this. And understanding these energies help us to communicate that. Dave, any thoughts, comments before we're finished for today?
No. Very great contribution
Okay.
from these folks.
Yeah, yep. All right, so we'll pick up where we left off. We're going to be talking about things like powerless points and what happens when we divide the change grid into 8 sections and 9 sections, but ultimately we're going to get to a 16-section change grid layer that describes the 16 specific energies that we really want to be fluent in to provide our client with simple but powerful insight and understanding as we guide them on their course of change. So with that, thanks so much for joining in, everyone. We'll pick up next week. Take care. Bye for now.